Okay, so I guess we can get started. If more people join, we'll let them in as we go on. So I just wanted to start by welcoming everybody to the final mediations of this school year. It's a sort of special edition mediations where we've invited people presenting at Congress and the other association conferences who might want to present a sort of dry run of the presentation. So we have one person presenting today. First of all, before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the University of Western Ontario is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chinootan nations on lands connected with the Dish and One Spoon Covenant Wampum and the London Township and Songbird Treaties of 1796. I also wanted to mention that today is Red Dress Day, which is an annual event held in memory of the lives of an unknown number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people across Canada. The day calls attention to the ongoing disproportionate rates of violence experienced by Indigenous people in Canada. And I'll put links in the chat to the Commission report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, and also to the Red Dress Project for anyone who wants more information. So now getting on with this final mediations of the year, I want to introduce you to Mackenzie Jessup, who is Media Studies PhD candidate here in FIMS, who will be presenting a talk called Revisiting Asian American Representations of Hollywood, Negotiating Identity, Gender, and Sexuality. And so Mackenzie will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to any questions or comments anyone might have. And you can either raise your hand using the hand raising function of Zoom, or put a question in the chat, and we'll try to keep an eye on both of those. And yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and let Mackenzie start talking.
Okay, well, before I formally begin my presentation, I'm just going to share my screen. So, oh, perfect. All right, is that clear for everybody? Okay, I'm seeing a nodding head from Pam, and that is comforting. So I'm just, that's, ooh, I'm good. Okay. And okay, you all see it? Okay, so hello everybody. I'm here today to present my research, which I did previously as a master's major research with a supervisor, which I entitled Revisiting Asian American Representation in Hollywood, Negotiating Identity, Gender, and Sexuality. I started this project because of films like Crazy Asians and Always Be My Maybe, which were very mainstream American films that featured Asian American characters as the central lead. And I was very happy to see this, but I also found myself asking, why is this happening now? Why didn't this happen like 20 or 30 years ago? And that's part of the central research question I try to answer. Why is this happening now? And are these new mainstream American films examples of good representation, or do they fall back on perhaps regressive? I'll be examining two films comparatively, Always Be My Maybe, which was released in 2019, and The Half of It, which was released in 2020, both of which are on Netflix. I examined these films because they are fairly mainstream. They were on Netflix, which is a widely used streaming platform, and a lot of people would have had access to them. And, you know, they both clearly have something resembling a budget. They don't look like budget indie films. I'll get into why that's a relevant point later. But first, a little context. So historically, Asian representation in Hollywood has not been great, but it's not just Hollywood, it's all of the Western canon. And a lot of this was part of a project, well, not really a project, a trend in literature, art, and later film called Orientalism, which was a concept described by Edward Said in his eponymous work, Orientalism. The title had more impact back in the 70s when he published it, but yeah. Orientalism, as he describes it, is the caricaturing of Asians. At the time he was talking about people from Middle East, but it can also Asians, East Asians in particular, as in a way that kind of reinforces white supremacy. Now, Hollywood managed to take this horrible thing and broadcast it on millions of screens for almost a century. And they did this through gender and sexuality, very notable because the project of Orientalism serves to reinforce white supremacy by portraying Asians as other, as foreign, as worthy of being conquered by a man who's the presumed reader of the text. These ideas translated into film through gender and sexuality, with the depiction of Asian women as hypersexual and available to white men, and Asian men as effeminate and submissive and something that needs to be conquered on the way to obtaining Asian women. You know, as a 2-for-1 on a terrible thing, it reduces an entire race down to a single characteristic, and it also objectifies women at the same time. It's two birds with one horrible stone. But yeah. And yeah, now this creates a lot of problems. First of all, it reinforces white supremacy and racism through sexual domination and encouraging ideas of conquest. But these depictions also prevent a full understanding of the Asian American experience. It's not Asian Americans writing these stories, white people exaggerating what they see and what they think about Asian Americans, and then building on those exaggerations for centuries, which doesn't really leave Asian authors a lot of room to say, hey, no, this is my life. And this was one, it doesn't really leave the film goer or the reader with a truer understanding of what grow up Asian. It just stereotype that white makes you feel, well, if you're a white person who's not aware, I don't know how it would make you feel, really. Well, actually, I do. Digressing. Yes. So it just leaves you with an ideological caricature that leaves Asian Americans seeming mysterious and foreign. And the thing is, remember I said Asian authors don't have room to speak in this? Well, they could still observe it, critique it, onto it. And they did. I did a little research in and particularly after World War II, particularly the 1960s, there was an independent film movement called Asian American Film and Video. And it started out largely publicly funded for the purpose of educating and producing good representation. Yeah, a lot of it was PBS and National Association of Television. But they were a lot of documentaries and very serious films aimed at showing, no, Asian Americans are not these stereotypes. They are living people. And there was a very palpable honest, noble sense to these early documentaries. Unfortunately, they were also very, very dry because, well, they were built with a very noble, specific purpose, and they didn't achieve a lot of success outside of people already interested in the movement. However, this little problem was solved by successive filmmakers. In the 80s, into the 90s, into the 2000s, there were a number of independent film directors who were not as filled up with the project of encouraging good representation, just wanted to tell good stories about Asian Americans. One example that comes to mind is Justin Lin, who directed Better Luck Tomorrow, has since gone on to direct several entries in the Fast and Furious franchise, including Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, which he does subvert a lot of stereotypes of Japan. Well, just another country, as how filmmakers usually depict Japan in a very exotic way. Now, a lot of these filmmakers drew on Hollywood convention, tried to make like mainstream style films, or they drew on Hong Kong action conventions because, well, partially because for a lot of Asian Americans prior to the 2000s, that likely was one of the only sources for representation was films from Hong Kong. Speaking of which, the films from Asia and their influence cannot be understated in this movement, but with an asterisk, because Hong Kong cinema and, well, Hong Kong cinema, especially Bruce Lee, it provided a counterexample to a lot of the feminine, subservient masculinity images that were projected onto Asian American men. However, this also created another stereotype where suddenly now everybody who's Asian knows how to do kung fu, but that's not on Bruce Lee, that's on the people who misinterpreted his whole thing. Digressing. There's also another problem with using Asian from Asia about other Asians as a form of representation. Asians in Asia are the dominant group typically, and within Asia there can be interethnic problems that actually lead to regional cinemas, and they've got their whole own other thing. The issue of Asian representation in Hollywood is not to be solved by going to Asia. It is best solved when Asian American directors get their hands on the camera. Now, in the face of all this, it might seem a little strange, against all of the century of oppressive filmmaking and representation, that films like Crazy Rich Asians, half of it, or To All the Boys I've Loved Before, have, come into the mainstream. But there are a couple of reasons for this. There is a growing influence of economies from Asia, China and South Korea in particular, that has made possible for Asian people to appear on the screen as often as they do. However, this usually manifests in stuff like Chow Yun-fat showing up in Pirates of the Caribbean 3, or the being in that American Godzilla remake. It's the usual attempts to cater to Chinese markets is through actors or through, which not necessarily through appealing to an authentic Asian experience, which isn't great, but it does put the possibility of Asian faces on the screen. So, and that is something that a growing number of Asian American directors have taken to their advantage, and they are building on those previous independent video movies that were not entirely successful. Now, A long time ago, I mentioned that I was analyzing half of it and always be my maybe. It's time to see. Yeah, I'm finally going to make good on that promise. I keep mentioning that Orientalism prevents people from properly appreciating the complexity of Asian American life. And this is partially because Orientalism tends to paint all of Asia and Asians as one broad monolithic group, be easily understood by a few base characteristics. This is obviously not the case. And that's one way that Always Be My Maybe is actually able to demonstrate some moves away from Orientalism. The film centers a Vietnamese woman named Sasha and a Korean man named Marcus, both of whom are predominantly dealing with a Chinese American community. One of them has assimilated into learning the language. In this way, it kind of demonstrates sort of the, first of all, inter-Asian ethnic differences, but it also demonstrates porousness of identity as a concept, because Marcus learns to speak Cantonese and kind of gets broadly accepted into this community that he ethnically does not belong into. Now, on the subject of the complexity of language forming Asianness, there is the half of it. The Asian diaspora in the half of it is composed of people, because it takes place in Middle America and deals with a young woman and her father, who are the only two non-white people in a town, in a very small rural. And the film's sort of centered on the friendship the main character, Ellie, has with a local boy named Paul. And as he gets closer to her, he kind of learns bits of Chinese culture and how to prepare the food, how to actually speak the language. But at no point is he accepted in the same way Marcus is. These two films kind of posit the level. Always Be My Maybe shows the porousness of performative Asian identity, but half of it reinforces that, yeah, performativity doesn't make you Asian. My point is that these two films demonstrate the uniquely complex situation for Americans in the diaspora through food and. Now, on the subject of the half of it, which is a personal favorite of films, oh no, wait, I have added that part out. So a larger narrative that I have often talked about throughout this presentation is the role of gender and sexuality in Asian American representation. A big part of that is this white men and Asian woman relationship, where the woman is hypersexual and available. What I didn't mention is that usually in classic Hollywood, there is a level of violence to obtaining the Asian woman, which is disturbing for a lot of reasons, but it also usually involves a white man attacking an Asian man to get access to an Asian woman. This Always Be My Maybe plays that story out, but subverts it in a clever way, because in the film, Marcus and Keanu Reeves, like literally just Keanu Reeves playing himself in the movie, fight over Sasha. And Keanu Reeves, being Keanu Reeves, obviously wins the fight, but he does not get the girl. Sasha is repulsed by a man who goes completely nuts and attacks somebody that she knows, and leaves with Marcus. This does subvert the initial formula. However, it does also kind of reinforce the idea of Asian men as being conquered by white men. However, in the film's favor, it also subverts the newer but problematic stereotype that Asian men are just know how to do martial arts. Yeah. So the half of it also plays with this narrative of anger and violence, but it plays it out a little differently. In the narrative, Ellie and Paul have gotten very close to each other, and they are beginning to bond, to become friends. He misinterprets that to be them falling in love. They're not. The two of them, and she responds appropriately with fucking kind of horror and upset. This plays out how it would feel, how white men who have been raised with a narrative that Asian women are just available to them, how that feels from the perspective of an Asian woman. Now, one could argue Paul's just not that bright and he's just spending a lot of time with her, but it's hammered home in a successive scene where a white man who Ellie has spent no time with assumes she is in love with him for seemingly no reason and attempts the same thing. And on the subject of Ellie, he is actually a complete subversion of the hypersexual available Asian woman. She is a socially awkward lesbian, so she's not really available to any white men or men in general. That being said, her almost asexual depiction in the film does raise problematic because in addition to being depicted as hypersexual, sometimes Asian women are depicted as innocent to the point of asexuality. So, back and forth. So, in conclusion, have things gotten better for Asian American film representation? Kind of. In one sense, there are more Asian American directors actively challenging stereotypes in their film. On the other hand, there's a literal century of film reinvigorating those stereotypes, and they have to address them. It would be nice to just tell a story about Asian Americans living life, but you do, even subconsciously, have to deal with a century of stories that are not true. As such, the filmmakers have to work with those stereotypes and negotiate with the narratives in order to tell authentic stories. Maybe this comes in how Marcus collaborate of Asian American identity, which counteract monolithic ideas, and an idea that is also demonstrated in the half of it. Both films address sexual and gendered stereotypes about Asian Americans, violence and conquests, try to subvert them, while also capitulating to other stereotypes. These films didn't emerge in a vacuum, though. They build on decades of work from earlier Asian American filmmakers who, in a moment when Hollywood is now willing to tell more nuanced stories, are coming into the scene. And personally, I look forward to seeing what this group of directors produce in the coming years as Hollywood greenlighting films like G and Turning Red, Asian American representation slowing down. Any questions?
Thanks for that. So yeah, if you have any questions, you could either raise your hand and we'll start with Zach. Go ahead, Zach. Nope, Zach doesn't. Hi.
Sorry, I was just clapping. I don't have a question. I'm trying to think of one of how to phrase it. I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes.
All right, excellent. Anyone else have a question for Mackenzie? You can either raise your hand or, I mean, there's only 8 of us, so you could probably actually just start talking, or write in the chat if you prefer. Pam.
Thanks. I always have questions. So Mackenzie, this is really interesting to me because I worked with an MLIS student who looked at the representation of Asian characters in Canadian children's books. And it was a really interesting project. So as you were talking, I was actually going back to that paper to see what we found, because it was 2003. It was quite a long time ago. And so because the two works that you've chosen to analyze represent young adults and, you know, teens and young adults life. Yes, no?
No, one of them does. One of them, they're in their 20s.
Okay.
30s,
Okay.
30s.
Okay. Because some of the things that she found in doing, my student found in doing her analysis is that there was there was sort of a role of home and away, and so that one of the themes was sort of the immigrant experience. So either it was a student or a child of Asian origin coming to Canada and getting used to life in Canada, or a second or third generation child reconnecting with their culture. Or one of the really interesting and disturbing things that we found in looking at this literature is that very commonly the Asian it was a story about white kids moving, say, to a new neighborhood, and there was a wise elder who was an Asian character who was the one that kind of facilitated that transition for the white kid. And then one of the other themes that we found was that there was this sort of mythical representation of some mythical Asian place, fantasy place, where the action took place. And that was, you know, usually a folktale, but sometimes it was a modern story. So I'm just curious about sort of how you chose these works to study, and whether the things that Grace Coe found in children's literature also were evident in the films that you thought about analyzing.
I'm actually really glad you brought all of that up, because first of all, the wise old Asian guy thing is very much a stereotype. And the worst part is, I'll get back to it. Because first of all, that actually sounds fascinating, horrifying, fascinating. But I chose these films mostly because they were mainstream and they dealt with romance in some capacity. Also because you don't usually see romantic comedies where both the leads are Asian. You usually score where the leads are not a heterosexual couple, which is the case for the half of it. And that was something I noticed. Usually in depictions of romances involving Asians, you don't get, before Crazy Rich Asians was a big deal for a couple of reasons. First of all, that it depicts two Chinese people in love, in a Western English written story. And that it's kind of the same reason why I picked Always Be My Maybe. These films don't deal with as explicit, like, Orientalist stereotypes like wise old mentor or the mythical Asian homeland. But it's interesting you brought up that homeland, because that's actually the point I want. There is this concept in Chinese culture and representations of it back to China. Like, some diasporic communities really emphasize the goal, the connection, partially through that formativity I mentioned. Some, however, emphasize the destination and, like, you know, being here and being Asian in America, or Canada in our case. And the reason I bring that up is because these two films kind of play with those ideas. Sasha and Marcus are Vietnamese and Korean, respectively. And neither of them have any connection to China, but somehow Marcus has assimilated into the local Cantonese speaking community, and just kind of made a new homeland by adopting a culture that is not his. And Sasha, in contrast, is just perpetually wandering. She's a restaurateur. She goes all over. Free spirit does. For her, the destination is more important. For him, the destination is the homeland. It's an interesting kind of way of it. And in the half of it, China only comes up sort of as a backstory, vaguely mentioned as like, because at some point, Ellie does mention, yes, I was born there. No, I've never been. This wasn't, living in this small town wasn't permanent. This was pop off to someplace else. And I mention that because the next line is what happened. She's like, my dad has a PhD, but he doesn't speak English that good. So it's kind of a almost holding back in that. It's interesting. It's interesting. Am I rambling? I feel like I'm rambling. Okay. Does that answer your question, or Lillian? What you got for me?
I'm Mackenzie. I was listening to your conversation with Pam, and I'm not familiar with the one movie, but with Always Be My Baby. Do you wonder, like, I kind of wonder if it's less of this binary between like subversion and stereotype, but like a kind of engagement with the kind of the subversion of like the rom-com altogether and what constitutes a successful rom-com. The couple as a racialized couple, but that that this story between Sasha and I forget Randall Park's character's name in the movie, like they have this bond from childhood, and they have this bond even though sure their families come from different places, but it's that kind of same experience of being like first gen, right? Like so we're not talking about like away from home, but we are making sense of what it's like to be kind of caught between these two worlds as like a young person growing up in America. So do you like, is the literature kind of, or I don't know if you've done say marketing reception kind of like a look at the marketing and reception around the movies that you've chosen, but like is there a lot of work happening on this kind of subversion idea?
I have not done that much marketing reception on this topic. As to the idea of subverting rom-com as a whole, I definitely see that. It's a fair argument to make, and I definitely do agree with you, especially because, as I mentioned, that fight with like, there's a character I didn't even mention in this presentation, and it would have just gotten bogged down, but who Jenny, the woman with drugs, who just after the fight with Keanu Reeves, which I'm still surprised we were able to get him for this. Okay. Sasha is, as most people would be, kind of freaked out that men just violently assaulted her over her private residence while half drunk. And Jenny, on the other hand, is just like, nah, I'm staying. She is, if we're talking about like subverting the rom-com, then she comes across as kind of nuts throughout the whole story, or at least a little bit eccentric. And yet she is just down to kind of fill the traditional rom-com role. Does that make sense? Or am I spitballing?
I think it's a little, I watched Always Be My Baby like at the start of COVID, so it's the kind of details of the film are a little hazy. I think if you're giving this presentation at Congress, I'd probably want to include like a clip to illustrate some of your points. Like especially if you were going to like like speak at length about that fight scene with Keanu Reeves, it would kind of help illustrate, you know, if you had like a short clip to show. Because yeah, I don't actually remember what happens in that particular scene in the movie. I mostly just remembered it was funny. So, but thanks.
Thank you for the advice about including a clip. That I keep forgetting. Analyzing a film, you forget most people haven't seen one scene 53 times to get the exact timestamps down. Any other questions?
Okay, I guess if there are no more questions, we can wrap up this final mediations. Thank you, Mackenzie, for a really interesting presentation, and good luck at Congress. And thanks to everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in the fall. So thanks.